Welcome to the ultimate Wrath of the Lich King PvP class picking guide. In this guide, I'll be covering every single spec and class and letting you know my personal opinion and experience with this spec in arenas, as well as Battlegrounds, World PvPs, and Duels, but arenas most importantly, especially 2v2 and 3v3 arenas. At the end of this video, I'll also include a tier list for each specialization and how well it does in 2v2 and 3v3 arenas. One of the most notable things coming from TBC to Wrath of the Lich King Arena is the sheer amount of healing output that healers have in Wrath of the Lich King. They gain so many new spells that just exponentially increase their healing output. To counter this, you either have to have a Mortal Strike of some kind, whether that's an aim shot, wound poison, or a Mortal Strike, some sort of healing reduction, or crowd control CC to make up for that healing reduction. You may not notice this in the first season of Wrath, but as Wrath continues to go along, you'll just see how insane healers get, and you'll notice how much harder it'll be able to kill targets. The first class I'm going to start off with is Warrior. Out of the three specs, they have two viable specs, Arms Warrior and Protection Warrior. There's also a Revenge spec Warrior, I'll talk about that later. Arms Warriors are much different than they were from TBC into Wrath of the Lich King. You're spending the majority of the time in battle stance now because it increases your armor penetration. You have things like Overpower. If you cast Overpower while an enemy is casting, it does 50% reduced damage and healing. You have Blade Storm, and you're also able to charge in combat. Protection Warrior has some insane utility, being able to blanket silence, being able to use all of your charges and intercepts all while in defensive stance. You've got Shockwave, you've got Concussion Blow, you've got Last Stand, you've got an insane amount of utility, especially Mass Spell Reflect, and then my most important favorite talent out of the protection tree is Intervene will actually break your roots, so it'll remove slows. There's also a Revenge spec Warrior, which is an Arms Warrior, but instead of the remainder of the points being in the Fury tree, they're in the Protection tree with points all the way down into Last Stand, as well as improved Revenge. This is really only good against melee targets that attack you, otherwise you won't get any Revenge procs. One of the scariest comps to go up against in Arena is TSG. Arms Warrior, Unholy DK, Holy Pally. TSG is going to be the number one 3v3 comp you're going to want to play as Arms Warrior. Or if you're playing Prot, you're going to want to play Thunder, which is Ellie Shaman, Prot or Arms Warrior, plus a healer, generally a Holy Pally, potentially a Disc Priest. For twos, you're going to want to play with the Holy Pally. Holy Pally Arms Warrior is just one of the strongest matchups in twos. You benefit from freedoms, bops, sacrifice, and especially Sacred Shield. You can also play with other healers like a Disc Priest. They're phenomenal as well, and Resto Shaman being the last pick. But really, you can play with any healer in twos and do just fine. To summarize Warriors in Arena, they do an insane amount of damage. They have a really high skill cap, both Arms and Prot, and you'll notice that you'll probably still have the same problem as the previous two expansions, which is getting caught in a root or a slow of some kind and getting kited. If you're able to get uptime on a Warrior, they have just so much burst and consistent pressure, but they still struggle to keep 100% uptime, even though Blade Storm really helps with that. Moving on to Mage, I actually think almost all three specs of Mage are viable in Arena, Frost being obviously the most viable. You get new abilities like Deep Freeze, Frostfire Bolt, procs like Brain Freeze, and you have a lot of damage that you're able to deal. The problem with Mage compared to the previous two expansions is you're significantly more squishy. You can get caught out by something like an Ambush or a Chaos Bolt and just be almost dead from seemingly nowhere. Fire and Arcane Mage are a ton of fun to play. You can do things like Blast Wave, and they'll actually disarm the target and knock them back, so you can Blast Wave a Blade Storm. And Arcane actually has a Vanish, so you can vanish a Hodge or vanish a Poly or something and be unaffected by that. So there's an increased level of outplay with Arcane. The problem with Arcane is that it relies heavily on casting. You kind of have to get those Arcane blasts up, but you can have Palm and things to help you along with that. To summarize mages, they are great damage dealers with just an insane amount of CC. They're able to control an entire enemy team, but there's a lot you have to micromanage with mages, especially your health. They are extremely squishy in this expansion, and they have a significantly increased skill cap from TBC. Rogue Mage Priest is still one of the best comps in the entire game, but it's able to be shut down easier than it was last expansion. Mages are significantly more squishy. I think Frost is phenomenal, but they kind of lack some of that consistent damage outside of their burst goes, and I actually think that Arcane and Fire has more burst potential than Frost. Paladin actually has 3 viable specs for Arena. You've got Prop Pally or Preg Pally, Holy Pally, as well as Ret. Ret being the fan favorite, as well as just doing an ungodly amount of damage. I actually think Ret has more place in Arena than most people think. Even though they don't have a slow, they have an insane amount of utility this expansion, with stuff like Freedom removing stuns, having 2 sacrifices, and just having such an insane toolkit with instant cast healing or damage. Holy Pallies are also one of the best healers in Wrath of the Lich King, if not the best. It's either Holy Pally or Disc Priest for PvP. They have an insane amount of healing output, especially compared to TBC. Holy Shock in TBC was on a 45-second cooldown. It's now like an 8-second cooldown in Wrath. They also get Aura Mastery, Sacred Shield, 2 Blessing Sacrifices, and a ton of utility from a healing standpoint. People may think Prop Pallies are a joke, but you're going to run into them in Arena a lot more than you think you will. A composition like Enhancement Shaman Prop Pally actually goes into very high rated, especially in 2s. Prop Pally has basically all the benefits of a Retribution Paladin and all the healing of a Holy Pally, plus a Silence. To summarize Paladins as a whole, you've got 3 really good specs to choose from. Obviously, Holy Pally being the best possible spec you could play. They're a plate-wearing healer, and they have an insane amount of healing output. Retribution is very good, and Protection is not as good, but they're still viable if played really well. There are actually 3 viable Druid specs for Arena. Both Feral and Boomkin have talents and abilities now that make them viable. Feral is actually the best out of the 3 Druid specs, with Resto being the worst. I actually think Boomkin is better than Resto. Boomkin is very scary to go up against, especially when they have Starfall active and you have no way of shutting them down. This is the expansion where you really start to see Ferals come out of their shell and start becoming high rated. They get instant cast spells like Predatory Strikes, they get Survival Instincts, you also get Berserk, Maim is now a stun. Everything you know from retail Feral really starts to develop in Wrath of the Lich King. To summarize Druid, the DPS specs get a ton of new abilities and utility. Resto kinda still remains the same. Unfortunately, they're not as good as they were in TBC. Overall, Druid is a pretty good choice. Most people who pick this class are because they played it in TBC and Classic as well. Right now on beta, rogues do the most burst damage by far compared to any class, especially Subtlety Rogue with Shadow Dance and all of his cooldowns popped. Both subtlety and assassination have a real place in Arena, with assassination being the preferred 2 spec and subtlety being the preferred 3 spec. Combat is also good, but it's not that good in the first few seasons. It needs gear from some of the later raids in the game like ICC to have insane killing spree goes. I actually think assassination is highly underrated, especially for 2s. It just does almost unhealable damage and has better consistent damage than subtlety in my opinion. It just lacks some of that survivability and utility like Shadow Step. Rogue Mage Priest is by far still one of the best comps in the entire game, and if you can get your skill cap up there, it's an easy way to push Glad. To summarize Rogues and Wrath, they're even more insane than they were in TBC and Classic, with the amount of burst damage that they can do and their stun locks. They're now able to double cheap shot you with Shadow Dance into a kidney, so if you trinket the first or second cheap, you're just going to sit a full kidney. They're also able to do some insane things like sap without vanish because of Shadow Dance, and the best part about Rogues and Wrath of the Lich King is Wound Poison only requires 1 stack to have the 50% reduced healing. Just like with most classes in Wrath, Shaman also has 3 viable specs for PvP, with Ellie being the most destructive, especially in the first few seasons. Elemental Shamans are just disgusting because of the ability to have Lava Burst crit if the target has a Flame Shock on them, the ability to have Thunderstorm also knock them back at a range and do insane damage, and the fact that they get Wind Shear and Hex now just makes them absolutely unstoppable sometimes. Enhancement Shaman is also phenomenal. They do very, very, very well in Arena with Wolves up, with melee comps, especially when paired with a Hunter with that Mortal Strike or a Warrior like Turbo Cleave. They're able to just run over targets. Resto Shamans are pretty good healers, especially paired up with the Spell Cleave. The problem is they kind of struggle with mana and they do rely heavily on casting. They do gain abilities like Riptide, Earth Living Weapon, as well as Stoneclaw Totem, but they still struggle with some of that instant cast healing like Holy Shock or like a Disc Priest has. To summarize Shamans, they get all of the missing abilities that they needed from TBC and from Classic, especially Enhancement and Elemental. Elemental is such a strong caster in Wrath of the Lich King, and Enhancement Shaman is so much fun to play, with Resto being a great third choice. One of the biggest glass cannons in Wrath of the Lich King are Warlocks. Destruction Warlocks can do some of the craziest burst damage in the entire game, with instant cast Shadow Flame, Chaos Bolt that goes through absorption effects, and a Conflag into a Shadow Burn. Unfortunately for Warlocks, they are extremely squishy, especially to melee DPS. If you've seen on beta right now, a Rogue can literally 2-shot a Warlock from 100 to 0 with 2 ambushes. Warlocks are still extremely strong from the start of the expansion till the end of the expansion, but they need gear for some of that resilience, some of that extra health, or they need a healer just babysitting them. Affliction Warlocks are incredibly strong as well. I don't think they have a place in Season 1. They need haste, they need a lot of the stuff that comes from the later seasons, and I think they actually have a potential to become better than Destruction at the last season of the expansion. Demology Warlocks are also pretty good. They're not quite there yet, but they get very cool spells like Metamorphosis, and if played correctly, they can do very well in duels and 1v1s. One of my absolute favorite things about Warlock and Wrath, besides the fact that they get demonic port, is they have a Drain Soul execute. If you Drain Soul the target when they're at or below 25% health, it will do 4 times normal damage. It is insane because even if the target gets healed back to full health, it's still going to deal 4 times the amount of damage for the remainder of the cast. So if you don't get kicked on that Drain Soul, it's almost unhealable damage. I've seen Drain Soul ticks for 6k plus. Hunters are one of the most interesting classes in Wrath of the Lich King PvP. They have probably the highest skill cap out of any single class in the entire expansion. Marksman Hunter has crazy utility, with Chimera Shot doing several different things depending on what sting you have. Hunters also have Deterrence, it having Readiness, Roar of Sacrifice, just a lot of utility and toolkit that it was missing from TBC and Classic. Hunters are another class that generally people who played them in TBC and Classic will continue to play them in Wrath, which is some great news for them because they become significantly more viable in arenas. Both Beast Mastery and Survival Hunters are not bad in arena, but Marksmanship is just significantly better. It has way better consistent damage, and it doesn't fall off as the expansion continues. If you thought priests were good in TBC, they become even better in Wrath of the Lich King, especially Disc. Disc wasn't missing much from its toolkit in TBC, and in Wrath of the Lich King it gets even more added, and they become an absolutely unstoppable healer, being almost the best healer behind Holy Pally, or arguably better than Holy Pally. Shadow gets a lot of its defensives that it was missing from TBC, things like Fade removing roots and slows, you get Dispersion, you get all your hymns as well, like Hymn of Hope, and now Devouring Plague has no cooldown and does damage on the first tick that you apply, so you can just spam DP. Unfortunately, Holy is still not viable in Arena yet. They have stuff like Lightwell and they rely too heavily on casting. I saved the best for last, Death Knights. If you are a warrior in TBC or Classic, I guarantee at least 85% of you are re-rolling Death Knights. Death Knights are probably the best melee class you could possibly pick in Wrath of the Lich King. They are a hero class, and even with their significantly nerfed version compared to the start of the expansion, they are still such a strong class, such a strong performer from the start of the expansion all the way to the end of the expansion. Unholy is just such a strong class, especially in Arena, because its consistent pressure, its ability to slow targets by 90%, silence, and ranged attacks with its pets, and different types of magical and physical damage. Death Knight has an interesting skill cap to it as well, because bad Death Knights kind of do well, and really good Death Knights do very well. There are things that I really like about Death Knight, and in fact, I am going to be playing a Death Knight in Wrath of the Lich King Classic when it releases. Corpse Explosion is one of my favorite abilities on Death Knight. Having the ability to blow up my pet and just do insane damage, it does like 5k damage when it explodes, is just awesome. And in Classic, you're almost able to double Corpse Explosion as well, because you're able to pet stun, and then Corpse Explosion, and then instantly summon a new pet. You can pet stun again if you wanted to, and then Corpse Explosion again if you really wanted to. Otherwise, you'd save it for Death Pact or something. What separates a really good DK from a bad DK are just a matter of when to use your abilities. A well-timed silence or a well-timed IBF to avoid a kidney can really mean the difference of a game. I actually think Frost Death Knights actually have a real place in 3v3 Arena, just not in the first seasons. Maybe at the last season when they get a lot more gear. They lack a lot of the survivability that Unholy has, but they're able to do some insane burst damage, especially if you don't play the Obliterate spec and you play the Howling Blast spec. You could hit like some 6k Howling Blasts from a distance too. There are some Blood DK builds that work in Arena, but they're just kind of for 2v2s and they're not necessarily serious. I hope you've enjoyed the video so far. Now I'm going to cover a tier list for each class. I'm not going to include each spec because I think that the class summarizes each spec and you have multiple specs to pick between. I'm also going to cover the difficulty of each class to play and just give some more elaboration to how they perform in Arena as I go through the tier list. Now you may agree or disagree with this tier list, but I'm just providing my personal experience from arenas on the beta as well as arenas on Warmade over the years. And I'm just going to hop right into it. First, I think Death Knight is an S tier class. It is one of the best melee classes you could possibly play. It has spell penetration, it has physical damage, it's got ranged damage, it's got stunned, silence, it's got everything to defend itself from against magical targets as well, and it's not super terribly hard to play. Death Knight doesn't have the highest skill cap, but you're going to need to be a good DK if you want to push high rated in arenas. I think that Unholy's the best spec you could possibly play for arenas, with Frost being super fun for Battlegrounds, as well as sometimes 3s for low rated, potentially high rated 3s if you can get your skill cap up, and then Blood is good for Duels as well as 2v2. Paladins are probably the best healer in Wrath of the Lich King. They are a plate-wearing healer. They have a ton of instant cast heals as well as hots and shields on the targets. They just got everything that they were missing from TBC. Both Ret and Preg are also phenomenal choices. Ret would probably be more of an A or B tier slot, and Preg being a C or a B tier slot. Paladins are not hard to play at all, especially a Ret Paladin. You can have a ton of fun even if you're brand new to the game and do very well on a Ret Paladin. Holy Pally isn't terribly hard either. It's just about managing your Sacred Shield as well as your Beacon. Elemental Shamans are probably the strongest caster in the entire game. The reason for that is because they have a lot of guaranteed stuff. If you have Flame Shock on the target, you are guaranteed to create your Lava Burst. If they dispel the Flame Shock, then you get basically a free heroism for 5 seconds. You get an insane amount of haste for 5 seconds. Their Earthbind Totem roots targets, their Stoneclaw Totem provides a shield. They can still Ghost Wolf instantly and run away and not be slowed. They just have an insane toolkit, and Shamans are so incredibly strong. I think Thunderstorm is so good because it can be used at a 12-yard range. Enhancement is also a phenomenal choice for Arena. I don't think it's S tier, it's more of an A or B tier class, but they still provide a lot of team utility with totems and heroism. Beast Cleave can actually go super high rated if you have a strong Mongo team. Enhancement's Earthbind Totem also breaks their roots and slows every time it pulses, and their wolves give them a freedom as well as a stun. Resto Sham is more of your A or B tier healer. They rely too heavily on casting and they go very quickly, even though they've got totems and shields to help them. Shaman as a whole isn't terribly hard to play, but it's definitely hard to master. Being able to manage your totems, wind shear, hexes, everything isn't super difficult, but it can be a lot to manage. Warriors, the last class we have here in the S tier. I think Warriors are S tier because they're strong throughout the entire expansion. They're strong from day one all the way to the end of the expansion. I actually think Prot is probably better than Arms Warrior throughout the entire expansion. They just have so much CC, they're able to get on a target and absolutely lock it down, put it on stun DR every time DRs come up. Arms Warrior can put out some of the best consistent pressure out of any melee class in the game, right next to DK, but the problem is they kind of have issues with uptime. Not only do they have issues with uptime, they're also extremely squishy because most of the casters can just do guaranteed damage to them. Arms Warrior can be the strongest melee DPS behind DK when paired with the right comp, but you may find yourself in situations where you're playing defensive the majority of the game, and then you look for that one burst Bladestorm window. Moving on to the A tier. Now some of this might surprise you considering both Rogue and Priest are on here, and Rogue Mage Priest can still be considered one of the best comps in the game, but I'll explain why. Disc Priests are strong healers in Wrath, but they still struggle when a melee DPS gets on them. Unfortunately, unlike a Holy Pally, they're not a plate-wearing healer, and they have significantly less armor, so when a melee DPS rides them, they're just taking a lot more damage, especially when that inner fire falls off. Shadow Priests are significantly more viable than they were in TBC. I still think they are really good in TBC, but they struggle with mana and a defensive cooldown, and now you get 2 for 1 with Dispersion, regenerating mana as well as being a defensive cooldown. Shadow Priests still kind of rely heavily on casting with Mind Blast, VT, and Bobby Flays to try and do all your damage, but you're still able to do some of that instant cast damage with Devouring Plague, and once you get more gear and your haste is up, you'll be able to cast a lot quicker. Priests are pretty hard to play, and they're especially hard to master, especially Disc in my opinion. Shadow isn't necessarily the most difficult to play, but you're going to get rolled over in Arena if you don't know how to manage your damage and your shields. Rogue has the possibility of being an S tier class, but the problem is it's also extremely squishy. The second a Warrior or a DK gets on them, they take a lot of damage. They're pretty much glass cannons in Wrath. As the expansion goes on, they hit even harder, and they get some more health and resilience, but they're still very squishy. In my opinion, I love Assassination more than Subtlety. It's more fun to play, especially in 2v2 Arena when you're facing a healer DPS, but Subtlety is infinitely more skill cap, as well as way better for setups and for goes, because it has twice the amount of CC and mobility. Assassination's really good for that consistent pressure. Hunter is one of the hardest classes to play in Wrath of the Lich King. They have so much to manage between both their pet and their own personal cooldowns and melee abilities. They're very strong classes with the ability of Mortal Strike, and that's why they're paired very well with certain classes like DK or with Ferals. They're able to do really strong, but they're hard to master. Druids are okay this expansion. They're definitely not as strong as they were in TBC. Ferals are very, very, very good in Wrath of the Lich King, but they still kind of struggle with survivability. They have some increased defensives like Survival Instincts, but they come out of form a lot to cast clones, and outside of Berserk they don't necessarily have a huge burst go. Boomkins are super easy to play in Wrath of the Lich King, and they're very, very fun. They do a ton of damage, especially in Battlegrounds. If you just pop Starfall, you'll be topping meters all the time. They're a little bit harder to play in arenas, especially harder to master because you'll generally get trained, but good Boomkins have the ability to push very high rated, especially in 2s, which is surprising. Resto Druids are good. They're not as good as they were in TBC. I would actually put them more of like a B tier healer. They actually lose some of the toolkit that they had from TBC, like Feral Charge, but they're still strong in the healing output sense. Moving on to the third and final B tier. Surprisingly, Warlocks and Mages are here. The problem is they're both extremely squishy. In Wrath of the Lich King, even though the healing output is very strong, the burst potential is almost even stronger. So if you're a super squishy class like Mage or Warlock, you're going to get two-shotted by an ambush, you're going to get trained by a Warrior with Bladestorm, you're going to take a lot of damage and be forced to play defensive most of the game. Warlocks get a lot of the toolkit that they were missing: instant cast stuns, demonic port, the ability for Chaos Bolt to go through absorption effects, but they're still just way too squishy, and in my opinion they're not viable until the end of the expansion where they really shine. Mages are also at the bottom of the list here because they're not only hard to play in Wrath of the Lich King, but they're not necessarily the most rewarding. They're not as bursty as they were in TBC. You can't just spam Ice Lance and kill something. You actually have to cast a little bit more and do more setups and wait for your procs, so there's a little bit more to manage on that side. In addition to that, I think they're even more squishier than they were in TBC. Even though Rogue Mage Priest is still one of the best comps in the entire game, unless you're a god tier Rogue, a god tier Priest, and a god tier Mage, you're probably not going to push super high in Wrath of the Lich King as that comp. It'll get shut down a lot easier than it has in TBC. If you've made it this far in the video, I'd really appreciate a like. I've put a ton of time, effort, and energy into this video, and I think it turned out pretty well. I'll be sure to release more PvP beta videos very soon, as well as some pre-patch gameplay of me on my Death Knight. I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Allow me to